name is Yewande Kazim. I am the founder of Wandiville and Nutrition Conversation Africa. Nutrition Conversation Africa is an initiative by Wandiville in partnership with the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. It's an advocacy platform focused on eliminating African nutritional challenges, transformative ideas, and game-changing solutions. It is dedicated to eliminating nutritional challenges in Africa by raising awareness and promoting transformative solutions within the food system. Through strategic partnerships, NCAfrica has facilitated a series of impactful webinars, online engagements, and collaborative initiatives. These efforts foster critical conversations, drive awareness among the population by addressing the pressing issues of malnutrition and improve nutritional outcomes across the continent. On today's NCAfrica Fireside Chat, we'll be discussing COP28, the Aftereffects, while focusing on the direct and indirect impacts of climate change on nutrition. I have the honor of having two distinguished guests with us on this dialogue. We have Jess Colston. She is the Environment Lead for the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition at GAIN. She works across GAIN's programs, partnerships, and advocacy work to help realize GAIN's ambition to become a great nutrition NGO. Her work focuses on the links between food, nutrition, climate, and nature, and how we can find solutions which benefit both people and the planet. We also have Dr. Adedotun Owolabi. He's currently a visiting research fellow at the University of Chester in the UK. He's passionate about improving global health outcomes, addressing malnutrition, and enhancing food systems to create a healthier future for vulnerable populations. As mentioned earlier, we'll be discussing the COP28, the after effects, while focusing on the direct and indirect impact of climate change and nutrition. Thank you for joining us today, Dotun and Jess. It's a pleasure to have you guys on here.
Right.
Just for a brief summary, can you give me a brief summary of your experience, expertise in the intersection of climate change, nutrition, and the broader food systems?
All right.
Great, no problem. So in my role, I'm the lead for environment and nutrition at GAIN, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. So what I do day to day is all about looking at the intersection between climate change and other environmental issues and nutrition. So I do that looking at the projects and programs GAIN runs, but also advocacy events like COP. And my background is a bit more on the environment side. I used to work with the World Wildlife Fund in their international food team, particularly supporting the UN Food Systems Summit. And before that, very much a generalist. I worked for a couple of years as a strategy consultant, and my academic background is in politics and economics.
So I have a background in human nutrition, and I've had quite a number of years in the industry, and then also in development world, as well as consultancy role with some agencies. One of the few observations of my career was the fact that we realized that climate change is impacting on every part of the food system. And I have devoted quite about 2-3 years in the last few years, of course, of my career to climate change discussions at the different fora around the world. So basically, it's more about how do we mitigate, reduce the impact of climate change on sustainable food system agenda around the world. So that's a bit about what I've been discussing in the last few years around the climate change.
Thank you. And I'm happy to have you guys here because, we recently just concluded COP28, and it just seems like this big event away from home, and this major event where we have all the policy workers, everybody that is important working. But then how do we relate it back to our communities? The areas where, the farmers are working, how are we advocating? Do they even know about climate change? So how do we bring all that conversation back to remote areas? And, that seems, seems adaptable, but also, real. So I would start with Jess, because I know Jess was at COP28. So Jess, with the recently concluded COP28, we want to explore, like I mentioned, we want to explore the aftermath, particularly regarding the connection between climate change, nutrition, and the food systems. The DG of the FAO had emphasized on how malnutrition and climate change has been significant global challenges. Do you think that nutrition was adequately prioritized at the conference? And could you give us key highlights of the key outcomes from COP28 in relation to like nutrition?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think this COP has really been a breakthrough COP on two issues that relate very closely to nutrition. One is food systems, and the other is health. For the first time, both issues had a dedicated thematic day, and more than 160 countries signed this, very high-level declaration to say we must address climate change, food systems, sustainable agriculture, all in the same place. And what was interesting about that is there's some very strong language on nutrition included in that declaration, and the countries commit to basically ensuring access to safe, healthy, nutritious food. But the actual actions taken forward are, a bit more focused on resilience and adaptation, and a bit more focused on agriculture and production in that declaration. But what was very interesting for nutrition is there was a parallel declaration made on health and climate change, which also included calls to shift to healthy and sustainable diets, which I think then takes the other side about consumption. So I think you see nutrition coming through both the health and the food pathway. But the challenge, and I think we should come back to this, is we see these really high-level declarations, they get the headlines, we think, yeah, it's really on the agenda. But when you look at the negotiation processes, the formal part of the COP process, it's much more difficult to see that action being committed to and taken forward. So there were different mechanisms like the global stocktake, which assesses progress against the Paris Agreement. There's the global goal on adaptation. There's negotiations on agriculture. We can dive into more detail if interesting, but the big story is you just didn't see the same level of commitment coming out of those negotiations as you did with the really high level political piece.
So what do you think can be done like for each country? Like how can we prioritize and make sure that those actions are being taken into place?
Yes, I think it looks different in every country. So I think there's a piece first, which is really understanding where each country is at, the different issues in terms of malnutrition that affect each country, and what their food system looks like, and how those two things interrelate. And we did some work with the Initiative for Climate Action and Nutrition to analyse a lot of national level policies and look at how integrated nutrition were into climate policies, for example. So we have a bit of a starting point, but there's much more to do, I think, in understanding each national context so that you can then say really concretely, this is the action we have to take. And also importantly, this is the finance that can then come in to make that happen.
And more importantly, every country has, real work to do based on what, they can do based on their challenges or similar challenges, but, they have to actually take into action. And I guess that would depend more on like the policy worker, like the government, and pretty much private partners as well. Okay,
Yeah.
But I want to go out of that a little bit. Dotun, I want us to take it back in terms of when it comes to the context of climate change. Individuals often associate it with global food production and agricultural contributions without necessarily thinking of nutrition. Could you elaborate, like explain on the direct connection between climate change and nutrition, along how it impacts, like impacts or influence nutritional outcomes?
Thank you. Indeed, that's a very important question that you just asked. That's also because for many years we have neglected the impact of climate change on agriculture, right? We've had interventions around the world on how do we increase production food, how do we optimize nutrition and all of that, but then neglecting that there's some aspect of climate change that has been happening in the last decades, and it has really affected production, really. Coincidentally, we were not very apt or accurate with our plans and our plans as well as our intervention. It's very important to know that changes such as temperature changes, rising temperature has been altering the geographical distribution of crops, which also affects yields and then quality of crops, food. There's water scarcity, changes precipitation patterns and increase evaporation, which also increases temperature and all of that. There is the extreme weather events that we've been experiencing in the last few years. Since 2015, I have consistently experienced heat wave, especially in Europe, Since 2015, in Switzerland, I remember in 2015 in Switzerland, I was in Switzerland in 2015, serious heat wave. In 2016, I was in France, serious heat wave. In 2017, in the Netherlands, a serious heat wave, and so on and so forth. We've had series of that also happening around the world. So those are very important things. And one of the few things we also must understand is that climate change has an effect also on the nutrient content of crops, that are affecting the availability of essential vitamins and minerals, in various ways, which I personally would not like to go into, or maybe I do not have those information also. Is that the same way climate change is affecting humans, it's also going to be affecting livestock. There will be some impact on livestock as well, which we also have to take a look at the production of milk, especially for dairy farmers around the world. In different countries where there are dairy development programs, where they have little production of milk and dairy products, which they try to cope with. But then with regards with climate change coming over and over again and persisting in the impact, what you eventually see is that production of milk, of dairy product, of meat production will reduce, this as a result of the climate change happening around the world.
It doesn't. So basically, I'm glad that you mentioned that, people don't think when you talk about climate change affecting the nutrients of the crop itself, they're thinking of more of crop food availability or accessibility, and they're not talking about that. So I would get into more details, and I want to get you more details on how to pretty much break it down and explain it to like a farmer, a smaller farmer, but we'll get into it. So I want to go back to COP28. At COP28, there was a session titled Accelerating Transformation at the Nutrition Climate Nexus. And this session was highlighting the connection between nutrition and climate, just like what Dotun talked about. Can you provide examples of specific case study that demonstrate successful integration of nutrition and climate strategy within the food system? And, if you have examples of anything like in Africa or something that could work, that would be great.
In terms of examples, I think that there probably isn't kind of one big flagship example that I would pull out, but there's a couple of different things that really show how we can integrate both genders. So one, for example, would be around the advice that we give on which foods people should consume, which are often called like food-based dietary guidelines, but essentially the advice the government gives that guides nutrition advice, but also what's procured in schools and in public settings. And often that's designed for health, just to maximize nutrition, but it doesn't consider, for example, the UK one recommends you eat fish twice a week. Some people have shown that if you actually eat the recommended amount of fish, there wouldn't be enough fish in the oceans to sustain it. So there's a question of how we design those dietary guidelines so that they also take into account sustainability. And one of the best recent examples is actually Ethiopia's dietary guideline, which I believe came out last year. And if you read it, it really sets out in the introduction how climate change will impact food supply, what foods are available, and also how we should make sure that the dietary pattern that's recommended is consistent with not having a huge emissions footprint from food. I think there's quite a simple thing, which is being very efficient with the resources that we have. So food loss and waste contributes a huge amount to total emissions from food without really achieving any nutritional benefit either, because food which isn't consumed is also not providing any nutrition. And particularly around foods which have quite a high environmental impact, so meat and dairy products and so on, they're also foods that are often perishable, so they're often wasted more. There are some examples from Gaines' work where we've looked at reducing post-harvest loss. I think we actually had a project in Nigeria which was about reducing the loss of tomatoes. And we have projects elsewhere, for example, in Pakistan, where we're looking at dairy and we're trying to take waste products like whey and turn them into nutritious drinks. So that's really about trying to make the most of what we have and reduce those emissions from waste. And I think the third example I might highlight, although I don't have a kind of single example to give, is around which foods we eat. And choosing crop varieties which are also better adapted to the effects of climate change. They might be drought resilient, they might grow better in conditions where there's more salt in the soil due to rising sea levels. but they're often more nutritious foods as well. What they don't tend to be is our staple foods, so wheat, cassava, maize, and so on, but instead these kind of underutilized or local crops that people are consuming. And one of the really exciting announcements at COP was from the US, who announced a program called the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, which will be, I think it's $100 million of funding in Africa to find these underutilized crops and to improve the breeding and the access to those seeds, but also the market linkages so that they can be consumed more, which, if they manage to pull it off, should be good for climate and for nutrition.
Oh, that's actually quite interesting. I hope that they manage to pull it off. But one thing I want to use also mention to our audience is, for those that don't know, how does food waste contribute to, climate change impact and stuff like that in nutrition?
Yeah, so I mean, all the food that we grow has an environmental footprint. So to grow plant crops, for example, we might use fertilizers which are produced from fossil fuels, so that they produce some emissions to make those fertilizers. When they're applied to the fields, they then release a different type of gas, which also contributes to global warming, just to do with how it evaporates, essentially. And then we have lots of emissions that result from the harvesting, the transport of food, whenever that's used in a mechanized way. And essentially, if we don't consume the food, then we both waste all of that energy and the kind of emissions associated with producing it. But when it's disposed of, it can also produce methane, another gas that causes global warming when it's basically rotting. So it's kind of double whammy. We both waste what we put in, and we produce a global warming gas when it's not you don't dispose of the waste properly.
Thank you, Jess. So Justin, to add to what Jess just talked about, but to bring it back to, again, climate change is heightened by a risk of food insecurity and malnutrition. It intensifies, the threats for hunger and nutrition in extreme weather events and long-term climate risk. So additionally, it has the potential to impact all aspects of food security and nutrition in intricate ways. What climate, Dawson, where are you from, Dawson?
I'm Nigerian.
Yeah, well, I know you're Nigerian, but where in Nigeria are you from?
Ekiti State.
Okay, from Ekiti State. So imagine talking to a farmer in Ekiti, right? Mm-hmm. What climate smart practices can a smallholder farmer from Ekiti adopt to mitigate these challenges concerning food production, access, utilization overall? Because, for them, climate change seems so like something unexplainable. They can't relate. So how do you explain to someone like a farmer from Ekiti?
Yeah, that's a very important question you just asked. This also because some few years ago, I remember collaborating with some friends where we decided to take a look at how do we explain sustainable development goals to a layman, someone who probably don't understand what exactly it means, and one of the things we came up with was to develop a comic book, especially for children, school children who also probably do not understand what it is. So we developed comic books where we explain the complete sustainable development goals. Is it 16 or 18 or something? 17, and then in such a manner that they can understand. And that's also what I think is the first step in helping the layman in my local environment to first understand what exactly are we talking about when we talk about climate change. How does it affect me as a farmer who what I'm interested in is ensuring that I bring the crops to the farm, plant the crops, and wait for the few months so that I can harvest and then sell to the consumers or to the middleman who takes it down to Lagos for manufacturing or something, or into something else. So it is important for me as a researcher or as a scientist to first find a way to ensure that those farmers understand it. And so it is important to create awareness first about what exactly is this all about. When you look at how much exactly does a farmer make from what they do. It's really small compared to the middleman who takes it from them to the manufacturer. And the manufacturer makes quite a lot of money from them. The manufacturer complains and says, well, getting to your place is a very difficult thing. I don't think I will pay this particular amount of money. And I think this is also one of the reasons the Sustainable Development Goal 2 also talked about how do we increase income for farmers, because that's very important. Because at the end of the day, you find out that even though farmers' children are not eating well, is that not an irony? The farmers' children are not eating well.
Yeah.
And I explained earlier some time ago about a study we conducted in Ibadan, your state, where we used to have a dairy development program. We found out that the children of dairy farmers are growing very tall, which is very good. We thought it was because they like milk. Unfortunately, it's not because they like milk. It was because the infrastructures to actually preserve the milk are not there. They have no option than just to consume the milk. So
Wow.
in localities where this is also happening, where in Kebbi states, in so many places where they also do not have the same this kind of infrastructure to preserve their product, their crops, the same probably should have happened. Unfortunately, because the moment the products are collected, produce are collected from them by the middleman, the middleman doesn't pay a lot of money for them, and then you can see the reverse, the ripple effects of those kind of actions. So it is important to explain to these farmers to understand why we have to take actions. That's a very important thing to do, create awareness among these farmers and ensure that they understand what this is all about and the impact of this in different languages we have over 250 dialects in Nigeria. In different languages that they will understand, we must ensure that they understand that part. And then they also have to play their part, ensuring that they adhere to the new practice, I call it, the new practice elsewhere that have been implemented in different countries where things are happening. Then brings to fore why we have to conduct a very solid monitor and evaluation process, among these farmers, and ensure that from start to finish, we are involved. The governments are involved. The agriculturists are involved. Agronomists are involved from start to finish. Yeah, because this all affects all of us. It's unfortunate that we try to do good, and then at the end of the day, there is the unintended consequence.
Exactly. So what I'm getting from this is critical. One thing that you mentioned that stood with me was, even the farmer's child or the farmer's children are not eating healthy. So again, that's why we have, NCAfrica. It's a platform where we're in the sector, we know, we're aware of it, we're aware of the project, but does your neighbor know about, in terms of nutrition, about eating healthy and knowing how to eat, a variety of diets or including vegetables? So that is the critical thing that I also think is missing, where we tend to work in these remote areas and communities. We work with a partner, we work with the businesses. The farming household is also a missing piece. With communicating to them, how are you bringing them along to make sure they themselves are adopting those practices and eating healthy? So critical is finance. Finance has always been an issue. I want to get into something that GAIN did last year. I'm not sure if it's GAIN that launched it or GAIN was part of it. So as of COP27 last year, that's in 2022. There was ICAN, the Initiative on Climate Action and Nutrition, which was launched to catalyze, mobilize, connect, and advocate for addressing the significant nexus between climate change and nutrition. It established like a robust scientific programmatic policy connection between climate change and nutrition, and hopefully, I'm not sure about this, but advocates for funding in terms of climate finance when it comes to the nutrition. So, Jess, could you provide insight into the work and provide some examples in terms of the work you've done in terms of funding, but also policy actions? And then what are the policy options that within ICANN that encourages directory shifts, motivates people to promote innovative, sustainable practices across all the stages of food systems?
Great. I think that was a great introduction to ICANN. As you say, it was launched last year by the government of Egypt at COP27. And it's been quite an exciting year. So it's something GAIN partners on with the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, as well as Scaling Up Nutrition. I'd say so far we've really put in some time in 2023 into understanding both how climate and nutrition are linked, and also what the state of integrated action on climate and nutrition looks like. So we talked a bit about the kind of food and health pathways that connect climate and nutrition earlier. Under ICANN, we also looked at, for example, how both are affected by water systems or by social protection systems as well. So some kind of thinking there to tell that story about how climate change and nutrition are linked. But a bit more practically, we also did quite a significant piece of analysis where we looked at every country in the world, and we looked at a set of policies, both on the climate side and the nutrition side, to see how integrated the two agendas are. So, for example, we looked at countries' climate commitments, which are in documents called nationally determined contributions. It's basically the share each country has to reducing emissions under the Paris Agreement. And we looked at things like national adaptation plans, which say how countries are going to adapt to the effects of climate change. On the nutrition side, we equally looked at things like those dietary guidelines I mentioned earlier, but also where countries are procuring food for public services, so things like school meals or food provided in hospitals.
Thank you. And just to follow up on what you're saying, based on the conversations I was had at COP28, what policy recommendations would you suggest for policymakers to enact? That, what kind of guidance would you offer the general public in terms of addressing challenges with climate change and nutrition and health?
Yeah, so I think, it relates to so many different policy arenas. I think you wouldn't want to have a kind of single policy, but I think you would want to look across areas of production, like we spoke about earlier, how we're supporting farmers in different countries, which crops we're growing and where, with which agricultural practices. I think you can adapt that to both increase the nutrition from what's being produced and reduce the environmental impacts, and make it more resilient to the effects of climate change, like to floods and droughts and heat waves and so on. I think then on the consumer side, it's really about what we eat and how much, and it looks so different for different groups. And you could contrast different countries, where there are some countries in the world who are consuming, for example, very large amounts of meat and animal sourced foods, and countries who are consuming very little. But even within those countries, some groups are consuming much more, while others, are suffering from malnutrition because they consume such small amounts. So once you understand those consumption patterns, I think there's also an important role for policy in trying to shift diets towards patterns of eating which are both healthier and more sustainable. And some of those levers are the dietary guidelines we talked about earlier, the foods that we provide in schools. And I think Nigeria has a homegrown school feeding program. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know I'm not getting the policy name correct. But thinking then about, how do we connect that food that's supplied to local farmers who are using more sustainable practices? How do we make sure that food isn't wasted throughout those supply chains? And trying throughout to really create the right incentives. So the right incentives for the farmers through subsidies, for example, and different parts of support. The right incentives for the private sector in terms of helping them to use less energy or to produce things more sustainably, and the right incentives for consumers to eat the foods which both support their own nutrition but have a lower impact. And as I say, it really looks different everywhere. I don't think it's about everybody not eating meat in all countries in the world, or all farmers switching to the same agricultural practices. It really needs to be understood in terms of where we're talking about.
Thank you, Jess. Dustin, to add on what Jess just talked about, let's look at it on a country level. Even like you talked about how you worked in Kebbi, and then we compared it to Ekiti. So imagine the full system where you're advising in terms of policy recommendations. In terms of giving an example, you're advising the government of Ekiti. What are some of the recommendations you would advise? And, take it from a systematic approach. You're looking into markets, you're looking into farmers, you're looking into production. What are the policy advice would you give that's totally different? What's different? We'll compare it from Ekiti to Kebbi State.
Yeah. So indeed, thank you. I think it is important to, for policymakers, for governments, all they do is develop policies. We have quite a lot of policies in Nigeria that are not implemented. Unfortunately, we develop policies without infrastructure. So for me, it will be to begin to look at developing an implementable policy that integrates climate change consideration into health and nutrition strategies. Policymakers must be able to see how we can collaborate with the researchers and say, okay, well, we need this information. There's a high possibility that those information are very there and available somewhere. It is a high possibility that the agronomists in Nigeria have that information. Unfortunately, there's no collaboration between the nutritionists and the policymakers as well as the agronomists in Nigeria, who will say, okay, this is what we discovered about the current climate change in Nigeria. It is really being affected. And I also mentioned earlier, some time ago, that the bulk of our foods we eat in Nigeria are always imported from different countries, and I give an example again of dairy products that we take in Nigeria. 90% of the dairy products we take in Nigeria are imported from different countries, New Zealand, United States, Netherlands, and so on and so forth. So are we not sure? Is there no possibility? There's a possibility, actually, I think, that we are personally, individually as a nation, not affected by climate change. However, maybe the countries where we export product from or where we import product from are already affected by climate change, and the ripple effect is coming over us on pricing, on every other thing that that we can talk about. So it's important that we take a deeper look into these researches, into these findings, into this data, and understand what exactly is our major problem. That's only when we can develop policies that can answer those questions. So the governments and the policymakers in the different places must begin to look at this. I think we have jumped at global discussions that we do not even know our personal and intricate and challenges. I mean, in fact, I think in the last few years, in the last 2-3 years, we've had a very consistent and frequent occurrence of flooding as well in Nigeria. We've had conflicting information around, oh no, it's not flooding. It was just a dam somewhere else that exploded and then the water came everywhere and all of that. We do not have that information. Is it really flooding, or was it a dam? Was it a dam that actually exploded or somewhere, and so many things like that. And of course, the governments of Nigeria are very good at covering up issues. I mean, so that we are not exposed to the real information, what exactly went wrong. So for me, I think we just need them. We just need the government and the policymakers more straight and more effective at discussing these climate change discussions. We've had, in fact, so the bulk of the food also we eat in Nigeria, I mean, a large percentage comes from the north. The northern part of Nigeria produce almost everything. That's almost all the indigenous food that we eat. The tomatoes are produced there. The rice are produced from Kebbi State, and a couple of other things, other food products, the yam and all of that, are produced from the different parts of the world, of the nation. They experience high amounts of occurrence of drought in the last few years. Aside that, the insecurity is also another major problem, which has really become almost like a pandemic in Nigeria, or an issue in Nigeria. The farmers can't go to the farms, to cultivate and to harvest. Even if they do, the bandits go there and destroy everything. So that's also another major problem. It's important for us to take a look at what exactly is the problem. Is it the conflict in the northern part of the country? What amounts of food shortage do we now have? How do we create policies that answer these questions going forward, and we don't have these kind of problems anymore? It's important that we take a look at holistically what the challenges are in Nigeria. It's almost difficult or almost impossible to achieve this climate change adaptation or climate change agenda in some part of the world if we do not focus attention on local politics, local occurrences where we are deeply affected. It's impossible to use a global solution to address a local problem.
What advice do you give policy workers, and I'm talking on country level, this can be Nigeria, Ghana, what
Yeah.
advice in terms of policy can they implement or can they put in place to implement? So are you saying that before you can put the right policies, one of the key things that matter is data. We don't have the data. So are we saying, okay, the first step to gather data, what is that what you're saying in terms of the first
Yeah,
step?
that's what I'm saying. We do not have data, so that also brings into the essence why there needs to be a collaboration between the government who make the policy and the researchers, as well as the researchers in the institutes, to take a look into the data production, take a look at what exactly is the major problems, why we think we are impacted by climate change in this country. And that's also what we inform the solutions, really, that we want to provide for Nigeria in particular, or for the different states of the country on climate change.
Thank you. And what I'm getting from here is, because even when I was doing a little bit of research, I found out that there's been a lot of work done locally in terms of climate change impact in agri-food system. But again, there's that gap missing. How are you making sure that the researchers bringing the government body as part of it, are they submitting their results? So I think both parties has a blame, has a part to play. So how do you make sure you collaborate and make sure that those results, research results, sometimes research results, it just ends up being online and indexed. How do you make sure those research results are actually being impacted, like implemented, and then passing it to the right appropriate parties? So that again, it's another gap that, we need to look into it. And I'm sure that's not just in Nigeria. I'm sure that happens in other areas as well, because a lot of information online, but then people are adopting it, the government at the country levels adopting it. To wrap up, because of time, we're out of time, but I just wanted to focus on 3 things that you can both answer. And we'll go to Jess first. The first thing that I wanted to make sure that, for the audience to get is, just think about a smallholder farmer in Ghana, or even a food producer or market. What are the, clean example, what are some of the things they can do or practices they can adopt to mitigate, impact and climate change, to help, what is their own little contribution in their way? Number 2, the other one I want to say is, what are the key communication methods to, create awareness about it to the public? What are the areas that you think that we can use to improve and create awareness to the public? But also for, a student, because we do have student audience and people thinking of what to do. What are the opportunities available in this space in terms of climate smart nutrition? What are the opportunities available? So those are the 3 things I just want you to do a quick summary on, and you can pass it to Dotun to add to it as well.
Great question. I think taking the middle one first, I think it's really great to have these global and high-level conversations at COP28 and bring people together from all around the world. But I think the conversation that really matters is the one that you have with your neighbor or the people in your community. And back to that point about how we even explain a concept as abstract as climate change to people who are experiencing it, I think it comes down to, what have you noticed that's changed? Are you experiencing drought or flood? When you grow your crops, do you notice that the seasons are different, or the food that's available to you, where you buy your food has changed, and so on? And I think starting from that point and starting a conversation about, how is this impacting your life, I think you can then start to really connect those issues to the bigger picture. So I think the actual communication, which is a genuine conversation between you and the people around you, is just as important to what we can connect online and to in different groups and so on. And in terms of those actions that if you were a farmer or somebody experiencing the effects of climate change directly, you can take. I think there's really a piece which is about trusting the knowledge that you have. I can offer advice over here and so on, but first of all, understanding, where is your land? What's the context? Are there areas of great natural resources close to you that should be protected, like a forest and so on? Can you help to contribute towards that? Is your soil degraded, or is it in fact in a great condition and it's storing carbon in the soil because you're protecting it and you're managing it in a way that's sustainable? If you're the farmer, those things. I can't tell you. So the first would be to understand the context, and the second then to really learn from the resources available to you about that sustainable management and production practices. And again, that might be local knowledge that's already in your community, or it might be something that's out there that you can learn about agroecological practices or improved varieties or things like intercropping or agroforestry. You know, we talked about a lot. There's so much there. And I think the third is thinking about any opportunities that are available to you to advocate to your local government, to others, to look at this bigger systemic change. You know, what are you missing? What's the support, as Dotun was saying, that you really need in terms of funding or better varieties, or you know, maybe it's something else completely, like you say, maybe it's an issue about conflict and security. But are you in a position to be able to advocate or highlight that so that we can make sure we're providing that support that's needed? And coming to the opportunities for activism, I think there's so much. I think it's a huge privilege to exist in this time where there's so much momentum behind the food systems and nutrition issues globally. If you are a young person listening in, there is the Act for Food, Act for Change youth campaign, which I think is a fantastic resource. And I know there's a number of Nigerian youth leaders involved, and in other African countries as well. I would really take a look at it. I would get involved in the conversations on Twitter or whatever your preferred social media platform is, and just join that conversation. And like I say, I think everybody brings a different perspective. So I wouldn't go into it thinking you don't already have something to contribute. I think everybody really does.
Thank you, Jess. Over to you, Dotun.
Yeah, thank you. I think for general public or for people around, I think everybody has a role to play. I mean, the government does not have all the responsibility. We all have one role to play in ensuring that we reduce or we prevent impact of climate change on food, on agriculture, on nutrition around the world. One of my recommendations would be to encourage many people around the countries of the world to adopt sustainable lifestyles, you know, embracing sustainable lifestyle that reduce carbon footprint. That could include making right food choices, consuming locally sourced and seasonal foods. And I usually also encourage preventing food waste, and really not about reduction. You know, try as much as possible to prevent the food waste, to prevent any occurrence of food waste than reducing. Of course, nutrition is all about preventive measure. So that's very important. We also have to ensure that the communities are continuously staying informed and prepared for any climate-related health risk or risk in their different regions. It is important to see how we engage with the communities, you know, the different communities, engage with them at local levels and ensure that we stay also informed of what occurrences or challenges they might be facing, participating in projects and encouraging them to participate in projects that we bring into the different locality and the community. That's also help them. Everybody is responsible, and we must ensure that we let everybody know that you have a role to play. You are responsible for whatever outcome we have in the environment, and so you have a role to play. And that's very, very, very important for policymakers. I'll say it again, we must see how to collaborate with the different agencies that can play a very important role in ensuring that we bring a solution to the environment challenges.
Thank you, Dotun. Thank you very much. This has been an engaging conversation. Some of the key highlights that I heard was more, we talked about finance, which is very critical. We hope that, you know, from COP28, you know, the declaration signed that countries do adopt them and actually implement it. So we're not coming back next year and it's still the same conversation. We want to see actions, not just words. So that is the key takeaway from COP28. We like that nutrition is being prioritized, and we want to see more of that next year, and more, you know, more explanation where, you know, when you're talking about climate change, we're not just talking about, you know, agriculture, which it does affect nutrition, but I like the fact that you guys talked about more nutrition components of a crop, you know, the effects and the different contributions of how it affects nutrition. We talked about finance, we talked about policy, not just policy, but implementing it. And the critical thing is, how do you have data? especially for countries like Africa, do we actually have the data so that we can actually create those policies to be able to implement it? We talked about communication and how people can understand it. So we're all responsible, and that means you're responsible, Jess, you're responsible, Dotun, and I am responsible. How do we, communicate it just to our neighbors, people that we work with? They understand the project, understand the work we do. But does your neighbor know about it? Do your friends know about it? Do your gatherings, your area know about it? How are you contributing? And whether we like it or not, we're all responsible. We're all contributing to climate change. How can we, make sure that we contribute in our little ways and help mitigating it, or, making sure we're doing better and communicating those angles. This was actually very an engaging conversation. I would like to have you guys back after, maybe in the media, to see what the progress has been, and then maybe, after COP29 and see how it goes and see. So thank you. And we do hope that, from this comment and just from actions from COP28, that we're saying, okay, we hope through, there's a transformation in our agri-food system, there's adoption of climate-smart practices and mindful, healthy food choices, that we can contribute to a healthier and more sustainable world for our current present, but also for our future generations. And so thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to another conversation media 2024 before COP29, and things we look forward to. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
For the time.
Okay then. Thank you.